everyone. Thanks for joining. This is the third episode of our new series on Evals best practices. My name's Elizabeth. I'm a machine learning engineer on the Phoenix team here at Arize, and I'm joined by the lovely Shri.
Hey guys, like Elizabeth said, my name is Shri. I am an AI engineer on the DevRel team here. We both kind of focus on evals as well as this like evals best practices stuff. So really excited about this third one being the most recent one. Okay, I would say let's just dive right in, honestly.
Sounds good. Yeah, so inside of Phoenix and Arise, we have a couple of different eval types that broadly indicate what the output scores look like. And that is kind of the focus of today's session. The two main types are categorical and numeric, and each of those can be further broken down. For example, categorical evals could be binary, where there's two labels, or multi-class with three or more. And in measurement theory terms, categorical labels are considered nominal because they don't necessarily have order, although we do allow you to assign a numeric score after the fact inside of Phoenix. And then we also have numeric evals, which are numbers, obviously, but they can be discrete, like integers on a scale from 1 to 10, or continuous values like a probability, so ranging from 0 to 1, or anything. Numeric evals are especially handy because they enable more downstream computation and analysis, and they can be at least tied to real world quantitative values, for example, a word count eval. So, which eval type do you use and when? That is the subject of today's talk. And the TLDR is that for any LLM-as-a-Judge metric, categorical evals are going to be better. We are going to review the recent literature on this subject, show you the results of some experiments that we've done on our own, and also share some general guidelines for how to construct the best evals for your project. Next slide. So before we get into our experiments, I want to share some historical context and also some recent literature on this subject. So the first LLM-as-a-Judge kind of paradigms were modeled after what we call Likert scales. So you would see a metric like a G-eval style LLM-as-a-Judge metric where the judge is asked to rate the fluency of a response on a scale from 1 to 5. And you might not know the term Likert scale, but you've probably seen it before if you've ever responded to survey questions like this where you're asked to, rate like on a scale from 1 to 5 how, likely something is. So these are really common in social sciences and survey data because they allow you to capture the degree of a certain dimension. But even in the social sciences and this sort of psychometric field, there is some debate and disagreement about how to treat these Likert scales. They are somewhat difficult to analyze, and there's some debate about what is appropriate. But regardless of that, the Likert scales are really commonly used in human annotation and human judgment tasks. So it naturally begs the question of whether we should use them for LLM-as-a-Judge, where we're simply replacing the judge with an LLM instead of a human. So before we get into that question, we also know that LLMs are in general not great at numbers. You may remember the whole debacle where when asked to count the number of R's in the word strawberry, ChatGPT couldn't do it. It would give the wrong answer. So we kind of know from experience that LLMs maybe have some gaps in their numeric reasoning abilities. And a recent 2025 study showed that even the latest generation of models like O3, GPT-4o, and R1 from DeepSeek, they still struggle with some of these seemingly simple numeric reasoning tasks. So the modern LLMs may be crushing these math benchmarks, but they still have notable gaps in their fundamental ability to reason about numbers. For example, in that study, they found that GPT-4o even now will say things like negative 9.8 is larger than negative 9.11. So we know that there are issues. The newer reasoning models do tend to be better on these tasks, which is great. But we have there's hypotheses that LLMs are kind of inherently limited in their ability to reason about numbers due to things like their architecture, their tokenization process, and their training data. So then, in an LLM as a judge context, we also have studies to show that there's lower correlation with human judgment, increases in certain biases, and lower consistency when LLMs are asked to produce Likert style scores compared to categorical labels. Studies directly comparing these two approaches have shown that fine grained labels or binary judgments outperform direct numeric scoring. So there was one study that compared the check eval approach compared to G eval, and check eval was a fine grained categorical label approach that outperformed the numeric scoring that G eval does. And multiple studies back this up that fine grained dimensions are usually better than broad criteria. And if the evaluation can't be answered with a simple yes or no, then it should be broken down into further subdimensions. That's kind of like the base question you should be asking yourself. Can my eval be answered with a yes or no? Or if not a yes or no, like, you know, a few options. And that's a good indication that your eval is specific enough. So, for example, take fluency, which is a common metric that people use for LLM as a judge. And fluency is actually comprised of multiple subdimensions. So instead of just asking if a response is fluent, you could ask instead, are all words spelled correctly? Or are all of the sentences grammatical? And these questions can be answered with yes or no. While that increases the number of distinct evaluations you have to do, it will increase the response consistency and reduce model bias. And as a side effect, it also forces you to think more clearly about what specific requirements you have for your application. So yeah, that's it on the literature. I'm going to hand it over to Shri for her to tell you about the experiments we ran.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think that sets up a really good kind of baseline and foundation for what we actually ran. So basically, this experiment takes a base passage, and the passage that we had run was like the Paul Graham essays, for example, right? And it basically applies some sort of controlled corruption at fixed percentages. So I think we did like 11, 22, 33, 44, so on, all the way to 100. And so an example would be like on the left side there, that's like 50% corruption. So as I get into the test, like we kind of tested two corruption types. We did spelling and frustration, and then we actually also did sadness, but we kind of were able to tell that like the frustration and the sadness results were pretty similar. So I'm mostly going to just focus on the frustration results and the spelling results. And so this is kind of a visual of what the corruption looked like. So we took the passage, and if it was a 50% corruption, it would be essentially like half the words would be like spelled wrong. There would be something wrong grammatically. Essentially just 50% error sprinkled across like the entire passage. And then similarly for like the 11%, like 11% of the total passage words were changed. And so essentially, the LLM-as-a-Judge is then kind of asked to estimate what percentage of corruption there is. And so we kind of tested across several protocols. We did like the numeric ranges. So we did the 1 through 10, the 0 to 1, and -1 to 1. And then we also tried doing kind of binary labels on this as well, right? And then we also tested something new with doing like an A through E rubric, um, hoping to see if there was still some sort of progression that we could then report. And so this kind of controlled setup was able to give us some sort of like ground truth percentages, kind of allowing us to measure variance and consistency across different models, like is a certain model provider or model better at this? And then we also went ahead and tested reasoning models. So that's kind of like the quick overview of the tests that we had run on this. And then getting into the results. So the reason that we actually ran this most recently is because we did this test exactly a year ago. And the results were reported, they kind of went viral on Twitter. And so we were kind of thinking to ourselves, like, obviously, since then, like, there's been dozens and dozens and dozens of models that have been dropped, right? So as these models improve, like, what does that mean for our results? Like, does this now mean that LLMs are almost better at like getting that fine grain in between numbers, creating this like continuous scale? So these were our 2024 results, again on the frustration and the spelling. We did GPT-4 and then Mixtral as our open source model because we wanted to test, like I said, across different model providers. And these were the results. The greens are supposed to be essentially like what the perfect range should be. So if it was able to pick up on like the 11%, 22, 33, so on and so forth, it should have fallen into the green range. So as we can see, I think that the spelling ones are pretty blatantly obvious that they were just not doing well. In general, the general trend here is that we see a bunch of plateaus. We wanted to kind of hope to see that smooth relationship, but they plateaued, they jumped, and they kind of ended up like clustering into these bands of like they all went to like the exact same number. And so Mixtral seemed to be a little bit better than GPT in this case, but I think the takeaway from last year's test was just that the numeric scoring just fails. It's not able to capture that like fine grain differences. So then when we ran it again this year, here are our 2025 results. Um, I think that on frustration, the newer judges do a lot better of a job than the 2024 baselines, just at separating the clean passages from like the mid-range corruption. So GPT-5 Nano actually shows like a pretty smooth progression, we'd say. Its medians are pretty steady, and the distributions are fairly tight. I know that they're like a little bit loosey-goosey here and there, but in general, like this is a lot better at following kind of that curve that we had expected, especially on the frustration and sadness tests that we had done. There's a little bit of plateauing, but regardless, like I said, we still have kind of that same trajectory and correlation. But then spelling, I think, is kind of where we get lost a little bit. It's still a really tough case. Um, Across GPT, Claude, and Quen, the scores just they just keep plateauing quickly. And so after just a little bit of noise, I think that the models really saturate and they collapse across like the different corruption levels into like the same narrow bands. And so the expected like smooth correlation that we have between the corruption and the score just doesn't ever appear on any of the tests. So the images that you see here are from the 0 to 10 tests. Um, and I mean, we had pretty similar results across the -1 to 1 and then the 0 to 1 as well. In general, I think that especially for spelling, it's not able to kind of like break through that, like, okay, this is 11%, this is 22, and so on. And so I think it kind of just ends up banding into like one range of scores. And so I think the distribution plots kind of like make the problem a little bit more obvious. I mean, you see the plateaus and you see the clustering that like a single number would hide. And so I think like numeric scores are useful for probably like bigger, coarser differences, but I think it's still really unreliable for the judgment here for spelling. We were also talking about how in general, like the frustration and the spelling and the sadness is something that I think like model benchmarks and stuff have improved when it comes to models, but the idea of like spelling corruption, I don't think is something that's super prevalent when you're tuning a model. And so I wasn't surprised to see that model like detection of things like frustration, sadness, just in general, like sentiment analysis was improving. But on something like pretty random, like spelling, like models are able to decipher spelling, right? And like if I was to like ask GPT a question and I had spelled half those words wrong, like it still kind of knows what I'm trying to get at. And so I wasn't necessarily, I think, shocked to see that it was still struggling on the spelling tests here. And then, oh, let me go to the next slide. And so keeping with the same theme, we wanted to test the reasoning optimized models to see if they had even improved stability in the slightest. And so these weren't a part of the 2024 runs, but I mean, reasoning models, I feel like are all the rage. Like last week or 2 weeks ago, we talked about using reasoning models and evals and chain of thought. And so I think it was just fitting to run these. And we were actually able to see that they did a little bit better. Like in general, um, it feels like they didn't, I mean, they definitely didn't plateau as much. And it kind of feels like they found this trend pretty similarly, especially on the spelling corruption side. And so I think again, like the main issue kind of stays where on spelling the failures show up a little bit, it plateaus at like a certain area. So like right here, there's a little bit of plateau right here. This was not as much, but still way better improvement than what we were seeing previously, right? So in general, I think that O3 showed tighter distributions, smoother medians. The scores rise in like the expected direction, but like the variance in general is lower than with other models. And so I think it's just a little bit more consistent to repeated runs, as well as there's just less sensitivity to like when the seed changes, right? I didn't change the prompt at all just because I wanted to keep it all even in a proper experiment. But I think it kind of matches research recent research studies as well of like I think reasoning models are a little bit better calibrated in terms of like the confidence, but I'm still going to say that they struggle to produce stable numeric scores.
Yeah, I was just going to say this lines up pretty well with the broader research on the numeric reasoning abilities of LLMs, that the reasoning models do do better, like significantly better on those tasks, but still not perfect.
Yeah, exactly. And I just saw a quick chat question in the chat of what is the green bar? So the green bar in all of these is what we want the model to predict. So the idea is like you have 0 to 100, right? And then we had the percent density is like the corruption of like 11, 22, 33, 44. And so the idea is like the scores should be able to reflect how much corruption there was, if that makes sense. I don't know if I explained that the best way, but I mean, that's like kind of where we want the scores to align. And so, I mean, yeah, Elizabeth, like last week we spent, or 2 weeks ago, we spent time being like, are reasoning models worth it? Right? Like, is that even a part of like the evals that we want? Is it worth it to have them? And so to keep that going, we kind of get here to like the cost and the token counts. What did we see last time with the complex and simple evals? I think it was like pretty similar results, right? And then it was just like the cost and token counts were like insane. And so it was like I mean, it's just not worth it necessarily to spend all that, especially with like the time, the tokens, latency, the cost, all of it. And so we can see here that it's still kind of that keeps up. And so the other, I know you can't read the models that well, but the other reasoning model that we had used was Claude Opus as a part of like the Anthropic suite. And we can see that that one is just, it was so expensive. On every run that I did of this test, it was like incredibly high. And then second, like I said, is O3. And then I think from there it goes to like the other models that we had done, including GPT Nano, as well as the Quen open source model. And so I think in general for the OpenAI models, like O3, like I said, showed smoother medians and lower variance, but the run cost was just several times more, right? And so I think with Anthropic, Claude Opus 4 was more consistent than 2.1, which was in the previous results from a year ago. But the improvements kind of tapered off at a higher corruption level, making it just like the extra cost is just, I feel, super hard to justify. And then with the open source models like Quen, I think the reasoning variance improves stability, but the cost gap is smaller in those like proprietary models. And so I think the charts here kind of just give that context a little bit more. And so I think it's a good visual to have. And I mean, you can, I guess, decide if the cost and the tokens are worth it. Um, so yeah, whether reasoning models are really, I guess, worth it depends on the use case. If you need that like super fine-grained, stable numeric judgments, like the extra spend might be justified, but as a reminder, like we're able to see in our results, like they're still not getting exactly what we want them to get. And so I feel like they're not as reliable as you would probably want your evals to be. So I think like if you are only needing those like categorical or like checklist style labels, I think the non-reasoning models will do just as good and give you similar kind of signals with that like much lower cost, closer to zero. And I think that was pretty much it for us discussing our results. Um, so if you want to go ahead and run the test and just verify what we had got, or even look at more of uh the results, I have all the graphs and stuff in this repo. So you can run the code. It's going to be the score evals test dot py from this exact repo. And we can put it in the chat as well for everyone to get access to it. This repo also has the results and basically the exact same test, just not updated, that we ran last year as well. And so I think this is usually my favorite part of these, where it's like, okay, so what? You just spent time listening to us for, I don't even know how long it's been, 25 minutes, right? And so like the so what is basically that I think that LLM-based evaluations always comes with this trade-off, right? About stability and resolution. And I think that numeric scores can oftentimes look precise, but at the end of the day, they're just pretty fragile, right? Like they drift depending on the prompt or the model or even the scale that you use. You'll see the differences between like I said, the 0 to 1 and the 1 through 10. They're similar. One might be better than the other, but in general, in our tests, we saw them bunch, we saw them flip, we saw them collapse, we saw them plateau. And so I think in general with binary and categorical judgments, on the other hand, they're just far more stable. They kind of align more closely with human annotations, right? You can reproduce them across runs. It makes just finding an error, like an error tracing, much simpler. And so I think like the letter grades that we had found, they kind of help reduce variance. But in practice, even the letter grades were more like buckets, right? Like a bucket of an A, a bucket of a B, C, D, E, rather than having like a super precise scale. And so I think the practical advice here is probably just to use discrete labels when you want broad, reliable signals and kind of, I guess, reserve numeric scores for cases where you can really control the setup and the calibration. And you can, I guess, pour more time into kind of like defining more clearly, like, this is what this range to this range means, like any score between these two. I think like our LLMs that we had done, we'd given it a couple examples so it can kind of like guide itself of like, okay, roughly like this is 0, this is 25, this is 50, this is 75. And so we kind of tried to keep it like an in-between amount of work for our judge prompt. But in general, I think that if you really want numeric scores, I think you're gonna have to really control your setup and your calibration. And so, yeah, like I said, if you want to try this for yourself, even test out what the results of that would be if you tweaked the prompt, made it more specific, less specific, whatever. Like I said, we have open sourced the code. So you can just run the score evals test .py file to reproduce the experiments. And then if you want to be able to basically reproduce like the cost, right? To track like the cost, latency, and token usage, you should go ahead and run Phoenix. And you can essentially just, I have all the Phoenix code in there already, but just run Phoenix serve in the back for a local self-hosted version. And you should be able to track the cost and latency and stuff as well. So I guess keeping with the Phoenix team, Elizabeth, do you want to add more onto this, or should we go to the next slide where they can actually learn about the evals?
Yeah, I think next slide.
Okay, awesome. There you go.
So yeah, if you want to put all of this into practice, the Phoenix Evals makes it really easy to create evaluators. Whether you want to do numeric or categorical approaches, the classification evaluator is the core of LLM as a judge abstraction in the evals library. And it takes an LLM, a prompt, and a set of label choices. The labels can be nominal only, like in this sentiment example, where you don't assign a score, or you can map them to a score. So in the other example, we kind of set it up like a Likert scale where you have multiple labels that are mapped to numbers. Uh, and you can provide any number of labels and any numeric, map them to any numeric value, which is a little bit different than other platforms where you have to map to scores between 0 and 1. We don't enforce that. So this evaluator type is pretty flexible. We've called it the classification evaluator because even these numeric Likert style evals can be considered a classification task. Um, but yeah, so this evaluator type is pretty flexible and satisfies most LLM eval needs. We are planning to add some additional evaluator types for more sophisticated evals, though. So, for example, pairwise evals or multi-criteria evals, even multimodal evals. So keep an eye out for those releases in the coming months.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty much it, right? That we had.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to call out that a reminder that I am hosting weekly office hours. So I encourage anybody from our community to sign up. You can talk to me about any of your evals topics, whether you want help getting the most out of Phoenix or Rise, you want advice on your specific use case, or you just want to talk about best practices. My door is always open, and I'd love to hear from you. We also have, this is an ongoing series of webinars, so the next one is in 2 weeks. And we've also linked to the recordings for the past episodes, so you can watch them if you want. I think we maybe got a question here as well, Shri, about how we controlled, it's clear how we controlled the density of the spelling corruption. Can you
Mhm.
explain how we controlled for frustration and sadness density?
Yes. Okay, perfect. So, that's a great question. Sorry, I didn't touch on that earlier, but let me actually go back to, I'll come back to the QR codes, but going back to this slide, um, we kept the passages the exact same across all of the tests, but for sadness and frustration, all we had done is essentially taken like 11% or whatever, right? Like read the amount of words in the entire passage, decide what 11% of it would be or whatever, and interject these like expressions. So like for the frustration examples, for the frustration expressions, it would be stuff like, this is so lame. Seriously, like I'm fed up. Like just like really frustrated, I guess, like phrases to add in. So it wasn't that it was like rewriting any percent of the sentences. It was rather just like for the amount of sentences, essentially it would like count the number of sentences and then at the very end of the sentence or the beginning or something, it would be like this is driving me crazy. Imagine you were going to spend the weekend at a little friend's house, whatever. And so that was kind of the idea behind frustration. And sadness was the same. So sadness, it would say stuff like I'm in tears. Like, this is so sad. I don't know. I'm in agony. Like, it's just like really, we have like a whole list of them. And so it would randomly pick out these like sadness and sorrow expressions and then essentially just put them into the passages, if that makes sense. So instead of like basically just taking a word and like scrambling it or like making it spell it wrong or like changing the order of two words or something grammatical, like add in extra periods and stuff, it would just add these like little phrases. that were like 3 or 4 words, essentially.